everyone, welcome back to another episode of Mr. Martino's Ledger. This is a podcast all about the fascinating and sometimes unexpected history of accounting. I'm your host, Mackenzie, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of HashBasis, a crypto accounting firm, and I'm based in San Francisco. We are finally back from our tax season hiatus. I know we have not released an episode in a few months, and that's just because we were swamped with a bunch of tax returns like 1120s and 1120Ss, things like that. And I really cannot be more excited to be out of that phase of the year and back researching some ancient accounting. Tax season went pretty well. We filed about 20 returns this year, so pretty consistent with what we did last year. And we filed mostly everyone on time. We still have a couple of nonprofit returns outstanding. Yeah, we actually published a full debrief article about it on our website, which is hashbasis.xyz. So if you're curious to learn more about the actual current accounting that we're doing now, and you can check it out at our website. Okay, to the actual history of accounting episode though. As a quick recap, we've released episodes so far about accounting in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt. We did a part 1 and a part 2 for that civilization, and also ancient India. And now we're moving even more east to cover the history of accounting in ancient China. And obviously, the history of ancient China, or China in general, is massive and spans millennia. So this is just, consider this part 1 of our discussion on Chinese accounting. We're going to start from the legendary Zhou dynasty all the way through the Han dynasty. So obviously, there's way more Chinese accounting history after that, like China in the Middle Ages up through the modern times, but we're going to cover that in season 2. This episode is just going to focus on the period between roughly 2000 BCE to 220 CE, which is when the Han dynasty fell. So I went to the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco to prepare for this episode. I think I mentioned that on the Indian episode as well. But to be honest, there wasn't a lot of ancient accounting artifacts at the Asian Art Museum, but it was just really cool being around the artwork from that period of time in general. Made me really excited to learn more and also just appreciate their art and their culture a lot more. Now, my main research assistant for this episode is Perplexity Computer. It's basically an AI tool that can do anything from researching this podcast to helping me create R&D tax studies to building mini accounting apps, which I'm doing a lot of these days. So I feel like I have to put this as a disclaimer now. We did use AI to help with the research, but I'm definitely a real person reading the script to you on a real podcast, and I'm not AI generated. So yeah, crazy times that we even have to disclaim that these days. But okay, for our episode, we'll start with a quick overview of the dynasties that we'll be covering. So just more general ancient Chinese history, and then we'll jump into some accounting history specifics. And let me tell you, the roots of ancient accounting in China are very deep, and the history is just as illustrious as Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, honestly, even if not more so. And so I kept seeing these quotes when I was doing this research that went along the lines of, China has the longest uninterrupted history of accounting, basically a 4,000-year-old tradition at this point. So just let that sink in. Accounting as a skill is about 4,000 years old in China. And so that definitely is kind of a mind-blowing amount of time. And Mesopotamia, of course, also had really old accounting, but their civilizations didn't really stand the test of time or last as long as these Chinese civilizations have. Okay, before we actually get to the dynasties, there's actually going to be a quick geography lesson that I wanted to talk about first, because, of course, we are returning to the importance of rivers in ancient civilizations. So this should come as no surprise when we were talking about Mesopotamia, right? We have the Tigris and Euphrates. Egypt has got the Nile River. India's got the Ganges. China is no exception here. So in China, we have 2 main rivers that are critical to the life and the culture of ancient China. So in the north, we've got the Yellow River, and in the south, we've got the Yangtze River. And I definitely recommend pulling up a map so you can just visualize what I'm talking about a little bit more. So to start, the Yellow River, again, that one's in the north. This is really considered the cradle of Chinese civilizations. Lots of civilizations popped up along these banks. And it's kind of sad, but it's called China's sorrow because this river floods constantly and changes courses frequently. basically it's just very unpredictable. And when you look at pictures, it's quite interesting because the water is like a yellow, reddish brown. And it's because it has a huge amount of this particular kind of silt. I forget the name, but it's not pollution, at least, I mean, maybe not entirely, but it's due to this particular silt deposit that's in this river. And so as you can imagine, controlling the floods for China's sorrow meant state legitimacy, meant power, so keep that in mind. And the Yangtze River, which is in the south, is actually Asia's longest river, and I believe it's the third longest river in the world. So yeah, this river definitely is very important as well. It's called the Golden Waterway since a lot of trade happened on the river, back in ancient times and also today as well. There's another important concept that I wanted to bring up as well, and it's called the Mandate of Heaven, or Tianming in Chinese. And so this concept, you might have heard about it like in your world history classes back in high school. I remember that's when I was first introduced to this concept, but it's really critical to understanding how Chinese dynasties work, and so that's why we are covering this now. So essentially, the Mandate of Heaven means that heaven gives the right to rule to virtuous dynasties, and heaven revokes it when they get corrupt, like when the dynasties get corrupt. So when times are good, this means the heavens are satisfied with the current dynasty. They're doing a good job. But if there's floods or earthquakes, famines, any kind of natural disaster, that means the mandate of heaven has been revoked and the dynasty has lost heaven's favor. So it's kind of hardcore, and it formed the basis for how state legitimacy and power worked in ancient to medieval times. And it's very similar to the Egyptians' concept of ma'at, if you remember us chatting about that. That concept is along the lines of divine cosmic order. Mandated heaven is pretty similar to that. So you're using this supernatural power or mandate to control power and resources on Earth. So just really important. I wanted to mention that. Last other caveat is I will do my best to pronounce some of these Chinese words, but I'm really sorry if I pronounce them incorrectly. I'm not Chinese. I was just listening to some Google translations or pronunciations. So again, apologies in advance for that. I will do my best. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the dynasties that we are going to be covering today. The first one is really cool because it's semi-legendary. We don't really know if it happened, which should sound similar to our Accounting in Ancient India episode. And this was called the Zhou dynasty, which we think was around 2000 to 1600 BCE. And I say it's semi-legendary because there's not really a lot of archaeological evidence for the dynasty, but it does contain the founding story for all of China's dynasties that come after that. And it centers around a mythical figure. His name is Yu the Great, who supposedly founded this first dynasty because he was able to tame a flood that happened at the Yellow River. He dug a bunch of irrigation canals and channels so that the river flowed into the ocean and didn't cause this huge natural disaster. And this guy, Yu, he's a hard worker. So in the stories I was able to find, he gets married, but apparently he leaves only 4 days after his wedding to work on flood control. And he works on these canals for 13 years, passing by his own house 3 times, but not actually going in because he has important work to do, right? He's a founder. So that's the semi-legendary origins of ancient Chinese dynasties. And maybe one day we'll find archaeological evidence, but it is kind of cool that they have this legendary mythical founder figure. Now, after the Zhou, we have the Shang dynasty. This is from 1600 to 1046 BCE. And this was a legit real dynasty in terms of we have archaeological records and remains from this time. This dynasty actually did produce the first written records in China, and they also had complex bronze castings as well, so they were quite developed. Their claim to fame is the oracle bones, which we're going to talk a lot more about in the accounting section. And oracle bones are basically animal bones. An example is an ox scapula or the shoulder blade, and also turtle plastrons or the turtle shells. And these were used for divination. And in addition to divination, they do preserve the earliest substantial body of Chinese writing that we have. So the way that it worked, if you're curious, is that the person getting the divination done would have their question chiseled onto these bones. The bones were heated and cracked with pokers, and then the person doing the reading would interpret the patterns of these cracks. So of course that kind of sounds like it could be manipulated or it's a little bit unscientific, but obviously that wasn't even a consideration back then. And then oftentimes a note would be added later on about whether the outcome matched the prediction. So there would be a follow-up with these oracle bones, which I think is kind of funny. Since this is the first recording writing in China, you can definitely bet there's a tie-in to accounting because it wasn't just divinations that were recorded on these ox bones. There were accounting records that were chiseled onto them as well. So put a pin in that. Definitely remember that because this will be very important in just a minute. Okay, after the Shang, we have the Zhou dynasty. They're from about 1046 to 256 BCE, so still super old. Now, this dynasty, they're the ones that actually coined the term mandate of heaven, and they actually had the first larger scale bureaucracy. And so that's kind of what the Zhou is known for. They unified China, had this bureaucracy, not as big as what we saw in the Han dynasty, of course, but they did set the groundwork for that. Now, in my opinion, the most fascinating thing about this era is that it's the era of Confucius, actually, our favorite philosopher from ancient China. And so I actually have like a whole discourse about Confucius that I'm going to go into now because I was very fascinated by his life and the work that he did and also his relevance to accounting. So Confucius, he grew up very poor. He was born into a noble family, but it looks like his father died when he was 3, so he was the man of the household responsible for his family. And the coolest thing that I learned was that Confucius was actually an accountant. Like one of his first jobs was as an account keeper at a granary. He also took care of sheep and horses to make ends meet, but there is well-documented evidence that he was an accountant just like the rest of us. So I felt pretty cool when I heard that, and I felt like I had this connection to this like super amazing, legendary Chinese philosopher. So his most famous follower, Mencius, he wrote about this period of Confucius's life. Mencius wrote, Confucius was once a keeper of stores, and Confucius said, in accounting, let it just be correct. That is all. So I just want to emphasize that Confucius, he's saying about accounting, it just needs to be correct. That's all. Like that's your whole job here. And it seems so funny and so obvious, but yeah, I guess he's not wrong. You know, the numbers have to be correct and the numbers have to add up here. So I thought that was kind of funny and pithy and definitely to the point. A professor that I actually drew a lot of research from, his name is Professor Guo Daoyang. He's kind of like the OG Chinese accounting historian, and he wrote a short article also about Confucius's time as an accountant. Obviously, he's like, you know, a modern day scholar. We're going to link to this article in the show notes, but I am going to read to you this passage that the professor wrote. It's a little bit long, but I think it does exemplify Confucius's time as an accountant. So this professor wrote, accounting work at that time was much simpler than today, but Confucius treated it seriously. He kept watch every day in the storehouse, did calculations, made entries, and supervised goods coming in and out of the storeroom. He patiently distinguished transactions of receipts and payments and recorded entries on bamboo slips. Every account was clear and accurate. Although Confucius was gentle and slow, his accounting work was much praised. Confucius was adept at the planning function. As he said, although he was only 15 years old, he was so immersed in his work as to forget his meals and so happy about his achievements as to forget his worries. No matter how difficult the problems were, he made a firm determination to examine the details. His attitude towards stores accounting was one of constant reflection. Day in and day out, Confucius continually pondered upon the question, what is the key point of accounting? Long after this diligent contemplation, truth was finally found. He once said, in sincerity and in earnest, accounts must be recorded correctly and accurately. End quote. So the last sentence there is Confucius just saying, let accounting be correct. That is all. And I think it's really funny that this professor is saying that Confucius was saying, what's the key point of accounting? Like, what is the point of this? And yeah, the point's just to be correct. So hopefully accountants everywhere can feel encouraged and inspired by that. Looks like Confucius was a better accountant than most of us. So I thought that was kind of funny. Now, Confucius is also from the state of Lu, which was like a semi-independent kingdom at the time. He also worked for the government and rose through the ranks there. But Confucius got disillusioned because the Duke of Lu, which was like the lord or the duke of this territory, he received a gift of 100 horses and 80 beautiful dancing girls, which is a lot of girls, from a neighboring state. And the duke didn't attend to his duties for 3 days because of these girls. So Confucius rage quit and roamed around in exile. The exile seemed self-imposed to me. I didn't see any details about whether this was like forced on him, but it just seemed like he was really disgusted with this duke abandoning his duty and kind of devolving. And so he just quit and became like an exile. So around this time, he was teaching his philosophy and his beliefs, which were very, very firm, and we can distill them into 5 different tenets. First one is called Ren, which stands for benevolence. And so this one essentially just means treat others with compassion and kindness. Confucius taught, do not do unto others what you do not want done to yourself. So Confucius was saying this way before Jesus, which I think is also kind of interesting. And this just seems like a universal principle that we should all ascribe to. After benevolence, the next principle here is called Li, or ritual propriety. And that just means proper rituals, following social norms, being respectful to maintain social order and express virtue. So what you think of as like typical Chinese virtues, like this is definitely one of them. Next is filial piety. So respect your elders. Again, very fundamental to Chinese culture. Next one is lifelong learning, so pursuing education, and he calls it moral self-cultivation continuously throughout your entire life. So I can definitely get down with that one because I think lifelong learning is just what makes being a human so awesome. And the last one is virtue-based leadership. So leaders should govern through their moral example and virtue rather than force. So at the time in China, you have like this Confucian morality type of philosophy, and then the other side was called legalism, and they ruled by force. So Confucianism was kind of like the reaction to that. So all of Confucius's teachings were compiled into a famous text called the Analects. It's definitely on my list to read that because there's just something kind of cool reading about like how to be moral and a proper person. I don't know, it's inspiring. So that's definitely on my list. Now the Zhou also went through their turmoil. They had their ups and downs. There was Eastern Zhou, Western Zhou. They had something called the spring and autumn periods. Then it kind of devolved into the warring states period. So it's all still the Zhou, but there's like different periods of it. But eventually the Zhou did go away and they were replaced by the Qin dynasty. And so the Qin, they barely ruled for like 20 years. They ruled from 221 to 206 BCE. So yeah, less than 20 years. It was super short, but they also were able to unify China, and their whole thing is that they standardize everything. So things like weights and measures, money, even the dimensions of roads, like how long your cart axles could be, were standardized so that everyone could use the same roads. And the same writing script that was also standardized. The first emperor of the Qin dynasty, he also built the Great Wall of China. Now, the Great Wall of China was built over like several periods, and I think it crossed dynasties, but it's mostly associated with the Qin era. And the first emperor of the Qin was also the guy with the terracotta soldier. So like a really amazing artifact of the ancient world. The first emperor, he seems pretty paranoid. He started working on this huge funerary complex when he took command. And so he had artisans build thousands and thousands of these clay or terracotta soldiers. And in addition to the soldiers, there's chariots, musicians, artisans, bureaucrats. So he was bringing like a whole terracotta empire with him to the afterlife because I guess he believed that like he was going to need them in the next world. And so I haven't actually visited the terracotta soldiers in China, but I would love to one day because I think it is considered one of the ancient wonders of the world. I also learned that this whole funerary complex, like it's underground and it's huge. So his actual tomb, like where the first emperor is buried, that's still sealed. Only his surrounding mausoleum complex, like where the terracotta soldiers, has been excavated. They haven't opened his main tomb so far because of the preservation risks. Like if air interacts with the artwork that's left, then I think the paint flakes or fades away. And also, I kept reading that there's like rivers of mercury flowing inside his tomb. And they have found like higher portions of mercury deposits outside of or like around the temple complex or the tomb. And so, yeah, there's also risks of that and things like like booby traps and stuff. So it's very Indiana Jones or very like National Treasure. But yeah, they're just trying to figure out like a safe way to open the tomb so that it doesn't actually get destroyed. So that's kind of cool. I'd love to see that be opened safely in my lifetime. I'd be so into that. Okay, and the last dynasty that we're going to cover on this episode today is the Han. They ruled from about 206 BCE to 220 CE. So that's 400 years that one dynasty continuously ruled. And the Han ushered in what we call the Golden Age of China. And so the Han is the main and the largest empire of ancient China. So many things happened during this period of time. It's honestly incredible to research it and list it out. So paper was invented, or paper was like kind of around before, but it was mass produced and popularized during the Han. The proto-abacus was also invented. So not the abacus or the soroban that we know today, but there was some kind of proto-abacus going on. The civil service was established, and while the Zhou had like a pretty large bureaucracy as well, Han China really took that to the next level, and it became even more large scale. And in fact, the governmental system that the Han pioneered, it was actually used until the early 1900s. And so that system, that was Lindy, like that lasted a really long time. Around this time, or in the Han Dynasty, Confucianism becomes the official state ethics. So the emperors are emphasizing morality, family values, really impressing that onto their subjects. And Han China was so important because even today, the largest ethnic group in China is called Han. And the Han Chinese today make up about, I think, like 90 to 93% of the population. And their name comes from the Han. So that really indicates how important this civilization was, or this dynasty was, to overall Chinese civilizations. So I know that's a lot. That's a lot of dynasties that we're going to cover. But the good part is that they are pretty well documented, at least starting with the Shang dynasty. So there's definitely a lot of accounting information to get into here. So let's go ahead and do that. And I was doing my research. The earliest record of Chinese record keeping or accounting is actually not writing. It's knots, actually. And so there's this book, this ancient book. It's called the I Ching. And the I Ching translates to the Book of Changes. It's kind of like an ancient Chinese divination or oracle book. And I think of it like tarot cards, but for ancient China. It's not exactly the same, but it's a similar concept. And this book talks about the fundamentals of yin and yang and how everything in life is just like a universal life force, like the qi. And so the I Ching, it's a pretty long book. It uses a lot of complicated hexagrams to answer your questions. And to be honest, I got a little bit confused when researching this because it seems like you ask an open-ended question and then you like read these hexagrams. Definitely look it up because it kind of looks like binary code. So that was a little bit over my head. But in the I Ching, there's a section of commentaries, and there's actually a quote that talks about these knotted cords. So in the commentaries, it says, quote, "In the highest antiquity, government was carried on successfully by the use of knotted cords to preserve the memory of things. In subsequent ages, the sages substituted for these written characters and bonds. By means of these, all the officers could be regulated and the affairs of all people accurately examined," end quote. And so unfortunately, we don't have any of these actually knotted cord devices remaining because they rotted. They're not really strong enough to withstand thousands of years. But we do have at least a written record that the ancient Chinese people had this kind of system. And this should ring some bells because the Incans are very famous for their quipus, which is also a knotted cord calculation system. So I think it's really cool that civilizations that are completely separated from each other by not only space and time and distance, they had the same system. So something about the knotted cord seems really deeply human and very universal. And so unfortunately, I wish I could say that we had some examples, but we just have written documentation about this. So my takeaway from this was that I'm going to get into the I Ching because I already have some tarot cards, which are really fun to read and stuff. But the I Ching is like a mathematically correct divination book, and I'm just personally very curious about it. So that was like ancient Chinese accounting. It's kind of just like, oh, they had this thing back in ancient times. Now, enter the oracle bones, because this is where we start to see some hard evidence about what accounting was like in ancient China. And so we already kind of talked about this with the Shang dynasty, but we're going to bring up the oracle bones again. So just to recap, the oracle bones were pieces of ox scapula or turtle shells that a Shang diviner would get really hot. They heated the scapula with a hot poker. They kept like sticking it until the bones just cracked. And then they read the patterns of these cracks and interpreted them as answers from their ancestors. So the diviner would also carve the question, the answer, and then, as I mentioned, the outcome. So they would follow up and be like, hey, what actually happened? Like, was my answer correct? And they had a Proto-Chinese script as well that they would use to write on these bones. And the really amazing part is that we have a lot of these bones remaining. Roughly 150,000 were recovered from a single archaeological site at Anyang, which was the late Shang capital. So it's really great that we have this treasure trove of evidence to see what was going on in the Shang. Now, these oracle bones were rediscovered in 1899, so at the turn of the century. There's this man, his name was Wang Yurong. He was the director of this imperial academy. He got sick and he sent out one of his helpers to get a folk remedy called dragon bones. And when he actually got these bones, he noticed that some of the bones had writing on them. And so previously, apothecaries, they had been getting these bones, which I guess they called dragon bones, and they were grinding them up because they were known to be good for your health. They were selling them essentially as medicine. But I guess no one knew that they were these like really precious ancient relics or artifacts. It took this guy who was sick to realize, oh, like actually this might be like a really huge thing that I've discovered. So at least we've known about them for the last 120 years. But before that, we probably have lost a lot of these bones, unfortunately, just because they were ground up and eaten. So in addition to divination subjects that were on these oracle bones, there was also accounting records like inventory lists and tribute receipts, because this was a writing or medium for writing. And so, of course, there's not just going to be like woo-woo divination stuff. There's going to be business on here too. So I have some example inscriptions that are more bent towards accounting. And so there was a king. His name was Wu Ding. And there was an inscription that was found about what was in his hunting bag. And this is from 1200 BCE. So just wrap your mind around how old like that actually is. The question that was written on this bone was, we shall hunt at Hui, which I guess is like a place. And then it says, can we make captures? So the answer was, there's going to be a bag of 1 tiger, 1 deer, 164 foxes, 159 deer, a brace of red pheasant, and 18 other birds. And so while this just kind of sounds like a king that's going hunting, this actually is an inventory record. And not just this bone that we found, but also other ones have lists like, oh, we caught 1 wild buffalo, we have 1 tiger, we have 7 foxes. And so they would actually write these out as numbers. So according to these oracle bones, the people in the Shang had a decimal numeral system, so base 10, that was already being used. So quite sophisticated considering this is over 3,000 years old. And in addition to inventory records, there was also tribute receipts. And so tribute receipts are just people paying money to the main guy in charge. So these receipts would list out the vassal, which means the person that's paying the tribute, the commodity that was received. So examples could be cattle, jade, cowrie shells, and also the quantity of this tribute that was received. So an example inscription that we have is, on this day, the king received tribute of 300 cattle from, and then whatever the tribe name was. And so even though it's not super long, it's not double entry, of course, it is a record with numbers in it, which pretty much sounds like accounting to me, at least a very ancient version of it. And so I definitely recommend looking up some pictures of what these oracle bones look like. They look like what you would expect. I would say they're just pieces of bone with really cool inscriptions that are written on them. But luckily, these have lasted for a long time because, it's not like the palm leaves in India that we talked about, or, well, I guess papyrus was pretty sturdy. But yeah, the bones will last a very long time, and that's what we have seen. Okay, so that was the Shang dynasty. That's the accounting that we got there. Now, the Zhou dynasty is really what ushers in a legit bureaucracy and a lot more accounting oversight and overhead. So as a reminder, the Zhou, these are the mandate of heaven folks, and again, they love bureaucracy. So I found a quote in this old accounting article that I was reading, and it said, quote, "In the procedural eras of internal control, budgeting, and audit, the Zhous probably had no peers in the ancient world," end quote. So that's pretty high praise for an ancient civilization, and it sounds like they had their stuff together, at least in terms of like financial planning and accounting. and also accountability. We have a primary source for this actually. It's called the Zhou Li, which translates to the rights of Zhou. And it's a text that describes the whole administrative apparatus of the Zhou dynasty. So pretty amazing that we had this text. And it does remind me of, for example, like Kautilya's text that we talked about in ancient India. That's really just describing like the governmental system or the governmental beast that's ruling this dynasty. So there was a prime minister, and he appointed both the chief accountant and also the grand treasurer. So chief accountant and grand treasurer back in the Zhou were like the two head honchos that were in charge of this whole accounting department. And the chief accountant had a pretty large accounting staff. Like there was a fleet of people working underneath him. And these people were responsible for receiving and dispersing money and commodities and of course for the accounting. So the main divisions of this accounting department were revenue, so the inflows coming in, expenditures or things going out, and then whatever the surplus was. And so all these divisions, it looks like they checked and balanced and examined each other. So it looks like this bureaucracy had internal audit and also segregation of duties already built into the structure itself. So in addition to these divisions, there's also a position called the zaifu. And most translations, I see this as like a supervisor. And this person was in charge of on-site auditing in the national storehouses, so the treasury. And I found a quote from the Zhou Li that says, quote, "At year-end, he requires officials to correct the annual report, at month-end, the monthly summary, and at the end of every 10 days, the daily totals." So the accountants could get punished or rewarded depending on how accurate they ended up being. And it sounds like they were very cognizant of like the revenue came in minus expenditures and what that surplus was. Like they were very cognizant of that surplus and they wanted to have a surplus. They didn't want to be in any kind of deficit, of course. And so there's also another direct passage that I found about the duties of this guy, the chief accountant. Quote, "He audits the daily accounts by cross-checking, audits the monthly accounts by means of monthly summaries, and audits the annual accounts by means of annual reports. By these means, he makes a complete survey of the administration of the 4 states and advises the king and the grand administrator on dismissals and appointments." So from this quote and the other one we just said, we can infer that there's a 3-tier audit cycle. So entries, or maybe not entries, but accounting is being done daily, monthly, and annually. So they're on this like tri-cycle here. And as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese government kind of had this system for like 2,000 years. So it started during the Zhou. The Han really like made it a lot more robust, and then that's a system that lasted for 2,000 years. And it looks like the kings at this time were very interested in the actual accounting, and it seems like the books would be formally presented to the king, and he would look at them and examine them and then dole out punishments or rewards depending on how clean everything was and how well the money was being managed. Now, one thing I want to mention is that there's a word that keeps coming up a lot, and it's in Chinese, and the word is kuaiji, and it's the modern Chinese word for accounting. Like I guess accounting firms would have kuaiji in the name, but it translates to accounting reckoning. And so the word carries with it not just numbers and mathematical calculations, but also the idea of an assembly, of bringing parties together, a verification, and I think like reckoning is really the best word for this. And that's really embodied in 3-tier audit cycle that we see in the Zhou, and everyone cross-checking each other. And it really just, it hammers home the internal audit function that's going on. Everyone's like watching out to make sure everything is actually being done correctly. So just keep that word in mind, kuaiji. It's really fun to say, and it's what accounting means today, or how it's translated. During the Zhou period, accounting records were written on a couple of different mediums. So first one and most common is bamboo or wooden slips. And so these were used for everyday records. And then the strips of bamboo or the wood were bound together with hemp, which is like a type of rope, or sometimes silk or leather cords. In addition to bamboo or wooden slips, there's also bronze inscriptions. So these were a lot more permanent, and they lasted a lot more, or they lasted a lot longer, probably were more expensive. And these were for more important and permanent records like royal grants, land transfers, and military rewards. I also found notched sticks as an accounting record, which I thought was kind of funny. So there was a wooden stick, and it was notched, and then the stick was split in half, and then each party kept one half, and then they were matched at settlement. So the two halves were put back together to prove the transaction, like to prove both parties. So I thought that that was a pretty good way to prove like who was actually owed or was going to receive something in the transaction. And then silk was the last medium. This was really rare and really prestigious. I think it did happen, but looks like it was more just used for like royal types of accounting or like royal inscriptions. So in the later Zhou, because remember there was a bunch of stuff that happened during this period. There's Eastern, Western Zhou, the spring and autumn periods, and the warring states. We start to hear a lot about counting rods as well, which were not a recording medium, but kind of like an ancient calculator. But it doesn't look like these were abacuses either. I don't see any mention of counting beads. Like there's no beads or anything. These are just the rods. So just a quick TLDR on the rods because they're interesting, but I'm a little bit confused about how they work. So hopefully I can explain these. So just imagine sticks of bamboo or wood. They kind of look like a, I forget. They look like a breadstick, honestly. I was looking at some pictures online and it looks like a little thin, like tan colored breadstick. And so you would arrange these small sticks on a flat surface. There's a top row and a bottom row. The top row was vertical for units, hundreds, and the 10,000s place. And then the bottom row was horizontal for the tens, thousands, and hundreds, thousands place. There's also a blank space for a 0. And there were red rods, which indicated positive numbers, and black rods, which indicated negative numbers. And so that last part is really important because it looks like the Chinese people knew about negative numbers way before Indians made them popular or wrote about them back in the 600 CEs. So the person we traditionally think about as inventing negative numbers is Brahmagupta, because he explicitly wrote about them in 628 CE. But the ancient Chinese people were doing this like thousands of years earlier. Maybe not 1,000, maybe like 1,000 years earlier. But still, I think it's really cool that these, like the ancient Chinese were just incredible. They invented so many things before the rest of the world even got on board. So I also thought the red and the black indicating positive and negative respectively was very fascinating because in accounting, we use those terms all the time, like being in the red or in the black. It's not as popular today since everything's digitized, but you know, when you had to physically write ledgers, like being in the red or the black was definitely terminology that was used. And so that harkens back to this time here in the Zhou dynasty. Again, we're going to link to some pictures so you can see what these sticks look like. And I'm still waiting for my husband to explain to me how this works. He's really good at math and, you know, the tens of hundreds, thousands of places, like, you know, figuring all that stuff out. So yeah, maybe he'll teach me how to use these counting rods and then I can check back in. All right, so that was accounting during the Zhou period. Their main thing was just bureaucracy. Again, we don't have too many like actual records of things just because things like the bamboo sticks and the silk, that doesn't really last super long. The bronze inscriptions do, but it's not like Sumeria where we have clay tablets or Egypt with the papyrus. I think we have a little bit more of the problem that we saw in ancient India with their palm leaf accounting just degrading with time. So not a ton of like actual primary accounting records, but at least we know how the system worked, like how the bureaucracy worked. All right, now after the Zhou faded, cue the Qin dynasty. So remember, this is the dynasty that lasted for like 15 years. They definitely made a splash on the world scene, but they burned out pretty quickly. And on that note, the Qin really remind me of this quote from Steve Jobs. Quote, "You appear, have a chance to blaze in the sky, then you disappear," end quote. Or also this quote from Dune came to mind when I was pondering the Qin. There's a quote that says, "I occurred, I am not, yet I occurred." And so that's how I think about the Qin. They were really important and they introduced a lot of important innovations, but they came out too hot and they were a little bit too brutal. And so people revolted and then they kind of lost the whole thing. But anyway, they sure left an impact. And as I mentioned, they were really into standardizing things to unify China. They standardized the writing system, so one script for the whole empire. They standardized weights and measures, the axle width of carts, and also the currency. The first emperor, who I mentioned before, the one with the big tomb, his name was actually Qin Shi Huang. He also burned a lot of books and buried a lot of scholars alive. And he was just really paranoid. He didn't like scholars going against what he said. And so, of course, that's why the dynasty didn't really last that long. The people that lived there were not really down to be buried alive. So he also established a very paperwork-heavy bureaucracy. And when I say paperwork, I actually mean like a bamboo slip intensive bureaucracy. We don't have paper yet. In 2002, we actually had archaeologists in the Hunan province, which is kind of like southeastern China. Archaeologists discovered 36,000 bamboo slips that were kind of wedged into mud in an old well that was then subsequently rediscovered. And so this discovery is called the Li Qin slips, and it's the single biggest archaeological haul of pre-Han Chinese documents ever. So that's a lot of words there, but just know that it was a lot of primary sources that we were able to recover in pretty good condition. And all these slips were essentially county-level government records. So these slips contain information on court filings, census data, grain receipts, tax records, military supply records, mail logs, personnel files, and there even was a complete multiplication table, which also just blows my mind. It's like so advanced on the math front. And one thing that I thought was so cool was the census data. On one of the slips, it records that there was 25,000 households, which is about like 100,000 people I saw. And so we know like how many people were living in this random province in 222 BCE. So these records have lasted over 2,000 years. And it just got me thinking, the IRS says we had to keep records for like 7 years. And then after that, they don't really matter anymore. These records have lasted 2,000 years. And so it just makes me think all the tax returns and all the spreadsheets I'm putting together now. Who's going to be looking at these in 2,000 years? Like, when will that be rediscovered? So again, we'll link to some pictures, but they look like what you'd expect is just flat strips of wood with characters written on them and just primary sources recording what the Hunan province was up to in this period. In addition to this big discovery that was found, there was also other slips that were found from the Qin period. The Qin legal code was actually found, which is pretty interesting. And there's actually a section that's relevant to accounting. The code says, quote, "When grain is received into the storehouse, the clerk must measure it in the presence of the issuing official. If the amount entered into the books does not match the amount in the storehouse, the clerk shall be fined 2 suits of armor. If the discrepancy exceeds 220 units of currency, he shall be exiled," end quote. So, pretty harsh punishment. At least you weren't killed, which is good. You would just have to give up some of your sick suits of armor, or you were exiled, which wouldn't be great. So, and as I mentioned before, the Qin ascribed to legalism, which was using more heavy-handed means like fines, punishments, exiles, whatever, to get people to do what you wanted to. This was in contrast to Confucianism, which was a little bit more gentle and emphasized morality. The Confucianists believe like, if we set such a great example, we're not going to have enemies. All these people are just going to want to be like us because we're so moral. So that probably comes with its own problems, but probably better than the legalism that the Qin ascribed to. In addition to the Qin legal code, there were also some slips that were letters, actually, between real people back in the Qin dynasty. There's one that I found that I really just love because it's so deeply human. It's literally just a letter, like a family letter, and we have the exact writing here, and I'm going to read it out to you. It's called the Haifu and the Jing letters. And essentially, Haifu and Jing are 2 brothers that were serving in the Qin army. And they wrote a letter home to their mom and their older brother. Their older brother was named Shang. So the letter goes, quote, "Haifu and Jing," these are the brothers, "send their warmest greetings to brother Shang and mother. How are you? We are both fine here. Send Haifu cash, not summer clothes. Once this letter arrives, mother, look in Anlu for cheap silk cloth that can be made into an unlined skirt and shirt. If silk cloth is too expensive, just send the cash and I'll buy cloth here and tailor them myself. We are stationed in Huaiyang to attack rebel cities. I'm not sure if I will be sick or injured during this tour. I hope that mother will send enough provisions for me," end quote. So I thought that was so funny. Just 2 dudes writing to their mom. And they're like, "Oh man, I hope mom sends me enough food. I hope I don't get injured while I'm serving in the army here." So yeah, this is just a really amazing example of a primary source that we have. And as I said, deeply human. It's not accounting related, but it is just a universal message, I think. So I thought those slips were really cool. It's really awesome that we have these still. All right, so that's it for the Qin dynasty. Again, burned out pretty quickly, but we have some pretty amazing records from that period. Now we're going to move on to the crowning glory of ancient China, which is the Han dynasty. So again, they lasted from around 206 BCE to 220 CE, so about 400 years. And so the Han were able to keep their dynasty way longer than the Qin, compare like 15 years to 400 years. So the Han, these folks were doing something right. And literally so much happened during the Han. We're just going to cover the more like accounting things that happened, but there's so much outside of that as well. The first point that I want to talk about is that the world's earliest surviving math textbooks come from the Han period. And bear with me, but they're called the Xuanxushu and the Zhuzhang Xuanshu. Those are two textbooks. And they simply have a bunch of commercial and practical math problems, like how to split inheritance proportionally, how to convert tax payments between commodities, how to calculate interest on loans, and how to allocate corvée labor. And so, yeah, there's just a bunch of math problems, and we do have an example problem here, which I'm going to read out to you. I haven't even attempted to solve it. I don't think this is something I can solve. I think I'm missing some ancient Chinese context here, but the problem goes, quote, "There's a county responsible for paying a corvée tax and grain to the capital. There are 5 townships in the county. Township A has 8 households of 2 people each, located 1 day's travel from the capital granary. Township B has 7 households of 3 people each, 2 days away," etc. I think there's a bunch of other townships here. "How many households should each township contribute to the corvée so that the burden is fair when distance and household size are considered?" End quote. So very long problem, but pretty practical, it sounds like. And I think corvée labor, we talked about this, I believe in ancient Egypt. I think it's like forced labor, like the peasants had to go do something for the emperor, like, build his funerary complex or his underground tomb. That was pretty much free labor. And these textbooks are exemplifying that problem. And someone was obviously doing the math in the background here. And I believe when I was looking at these textbooks have been translated to English as well. So I haven't read them, but besides, these problems, but definitely an interesting piece of scholarship and literature that we have. The next accounting type of, I guess, it's actually a debate that I want to talk about, but it's less accounting and more so economic policy. It's called the Great Salt and Iron Debate, and this is a hallmark of Han-China economic and government debate, actually. And so it was a debate between government officials and scholars about whether to keep the salt and iron industry state-owned, essentially a monopoly, or to abolish them, or I guess in modern terms, like privatize these industries. And the debate is really fascinating. One, because it was actually fully recorded and we have it translated. It survives to this day. But it's also eerily modern. Back in the day, it was between the Confucian scholars. They were more so on the side of, the government shouldn't own everything. Like, people should just be able to do their own thing. So those are the Confucian scholars versus the legalist bureaucrats, which were the big government people. And that's exactly the same kind of debates that we have today. Like, how much should the government be involved in owning certain industries? Like, how much freedom should people actually have? And we still talk about this debate like 2,000 years later. And so it really just begs the question, like, how much has humanity really changed if we're just having the same debates about how much should the state be involved, how much to spend on military, etc. And so I actually have a sample exchange of this debate. And so the first portion is coming from the scholars. So these are the Confucian scholars. They say, quote, "The state should not compete with merchants. The salt and iron monopolies impoverish the people, enrich corrupt officials, and degrade public morals. Abolish them." End quote. So that's their perspective. They think it's the government competing with their own people, which is bad for the people. And of course, they got to bring up morality because they're all about that. But then the government responds in this debate, and these bureaucrats say, quote, "Without the salt and iron revenues, how will the state pay the soldiers who guard the frontier? How will it feed the people during famine? How will it keep prices stable when the harvest fails? You speak of morals, I speak of resources. Without resources, your morals do not feed anybody." End quote. Whew, man, that was so fun saying that quote. And I can just imagine some like bureaucrat saying this back in the day. And TLDR, the bureaucrats won because at the end of the day, you have to protect your people and you have to feed them. And so the Confucian scholars were seen as a little bit more idealist and a little bit more high-minded and just not as realistic as compared to the government, which is just trying to keep their empire alive. And so I do think the salt and iron mines stayed monopolies, like they stayed government owned. And so to even have this sophisticated level of debating, you need accounting to know where the money is going. You need to know your revenue, your expenses, what your surpluses are. Again, it just shows you how sophisticated their economy is, and also the level of education of these bureaucrats and also the scholars that are debating this. I'll link to a pretty good YouTube video that I found that actually talks about this debate in a little bit more detail. But I just think it's so cool that we even have this record that's come down to us, and it's, again, over like 2,000 years old. Okay, the next big accounting invention or contribution from the Han was that paper was invented, or I should say, caveat was paper was mass produced and started to actually be used like by the whole empire during the Han Dynasty. And so I think it sounds like paper was kind of being used a little bit, like people knew they could ground up tree bark to make paper, but it wasn't really widely circulated until there was actually a guy named Kai Lun. He was a eunuch that was part of the Han Dynasty court, and he came up with his own special recipe for making paper. So this recipe included mulberry bark, so tree bark, hemp scraps, old rags, some like bits of fishing nets, and all this was pulped together, pressed, and the water was eventually dried out, and that creates paper. So, we don't put fish nets in our paper today, but the formula of tree bark and water is pretty similar. And so this invention turbocharges the Han bureaucracy. Paper can be mass produced. As we know today, a sheet of paper is thin, it's light, and you can write on both sides of it. It's not like oracle bones or bronze vessels where you have to spend all this time inscribing. And it's also, paper is way more compact than these cartloads of bamboo slips. The bamboo slips or wooden sticks, like while you could, I guess, easily write on them, the volume could just grow really quickly. So thank you, Kai Lun, for inventing your paper recipe, because it's definitely helping out accountants today. Now, unfortunately, Kai Lun does not have a very happy ending. He actually poisoned himself in 121 CE. Essentially, he was part of some like court scandal, court politics, and instead of being persecuted or exiled by the emperor, he chose to commit suicide instead. He served this empress, her name was Dowager Dao, and based on what I could find, she had Kai Lun kill another court lady that she just wanted to like bump off. And then once that was discovered, then Kai Lun was like, oh, like, I have to drink the poison now so that I avoid ruin. So yeah, definitely look up Kai Lun. I was looking at his Wikipedia page, and it is fascinating. This guy lived a very interesting life, not just including the paper, but again, all the palace intrigue as well. So that was Kai Lun. And then the last thing we're going to cover that the Han contributed to was the proto-abacus. The proto-abacus was invented. That's all I'm going to say about this here, because I actually think we're going to do like a whole episode on the abacus in Mr. Martino's ledger. Either the next episode or maybe one of the future ones, because the abacus has such a rich history. It's not just China. It was also in the Americas, in Japan, and then of course in China as well. And so we're probably going to do like a whole separate episode covering that. So the importance of the Han really just can't be overstated. They are really the golden age that produces all this philosophy, technology, and bureaucracy. And of course, the underpinnings of all this was accounting. You need accounting to have this big empire and bureaucracy to have it run efficiently. So yeah, hopefully this episode was interesting. I found it to be really amazing, especially not only the accounting, but I got really into researching just the overall dynasties of China. And we only got through like 5 dynasties. There are a bunch more Chinese dynasties that we're going to cover in season 2, which is going to be more like the medieval Renaissance season. So, all right, that's all that we have today for Mr. Martino's Ledger. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you.